And most of the clients funded were from the Hannon Trust rather than the Scudder Trust. Within 6 months, the Scudder Trust was exhausted and stopped taking clients. Within a year and a half, the Hannon Trust was exhausted and essentially stopped taking clients. In 1933, it closed its rolls and did not take any clients until 1946. So, in conclusion to my introduction, the trouble with charity, and this is a letter from the executive director at the time, Leon Frost, rescinding someone's pension. They could be taken away at any time for any number of reasons. They were also reduced periodically in 1932 and 1933 by $5 to $10, which is a big amount of money for people. You had no say over this. This is a letter that came in the mail. We have rescinded your pension. You'll have to make plans in some other way to support yourself.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Tom Jankowski. Please forgive me for reading my script. I want to make sure I stayed my time. I have a tendency to go over. I could easily talk about this for a couple of hours, but we have about 10 minutes. So I just wanted to make it clear that in order to understand people's lives, the people that my colleagues are going to be talking about, it's important to first understand the time and place in which they live. People are in large part products of their environment, and their behavior is shaped by the social and physical context in which they live. So I'm here to talk about that context, and the context in which people struggled against poverty in old age and the fear that marked that struggle. My presentation is entitled Everybody's Burden, because it deals with the public response to poverty, and elder poverty in particular, during the dawn of the Great Depression in Detroit. It also sets the stage for the case files that my colleagues analyzed by showing just how unsettling and insecure were the circumstances the clients faced, and helps to explain the fear that so many of them felt and expressed in those case files. It's difficult to understand just how far Detroit fell in the early years of the Depression without understanding how high it soared in the preceding decades. Detroit was called the Great City of Plenty by Frank Murphy in his inaugural address after being elected mayor in 1930. Its population had grown to 1.6 million from only about 286,000 3 decades earlier. By the time the Depression hit, Detroit was the 4th largest city in the United States and arguably the wealthiest big city of them all. It had the largest manufacturing base, churning out 5.3 million cars in 1929 alone. It had the most productive workers, the highest average wages, and the greatest rate of home ownership of any large city in the United States. And it was reaching the peak of its building boom at the time. Several of the buildings and institutions that are Detroit landmarks to this day, including the General Motors Building, the Fisher Building, the Detroit Institute of Arts, the Detroit Zoo, the Detroit Windsor Tunnel, and the Ambassador Bridge, which was then the longest suspension bridge in the world, opened in the year 1929. The pictures here show several different views of downtown Detroit in that year. And you can see the shoppers downtown and the traffic, and that's the skyline of Detroit in 1929 from across the river. Now, what kind of retirement can an older Detroiter expect to have? Well, that's a bit of a trick question, because there really was no expectation of retirement at all at the time, as long as one's health permitted working. There was no concept of the golden years. Workers were kept working until they were no longer able to do so, or until they were put out of a job for being too old, and that was a very common occurrence. It was common practice to fire older adults on the basis of their age, and no law prohibited age discrimination. Because of this, and because employer-sponsored pensions were still very rare, rates of poverty among the old were very high, even when the economy was doing well. So, to whom did the elderly unemployed turn for sustenance? Their first line of support, of course, was their families, mostly adult children. Despite the modern industrial nature of Detroit society, the traditional agrarian value of filial duty was still very strong, and it was actually enshrined in the law of the day. Under Michigan law at the time, adult children were required to support elderly parents who were unable to support themselves. An adult child who was able but refused to support a destitute parent could be sentenced to a year in prison at hard labor. But not every older adult had families, so many relied on a web of friends and neighbors to help them. When these social networks failed, there were private charities that they could petition for help, such as the Hannon Foundation. And in most cities, those private charities were really the last line of defense against poverty and old age. As Ruth mentioned, there were no national anti-poverty programs at all. However, in Detroit, things were a bit different. Because it had an unusually robust municipal welfare system that provided relief to older adults in their homes. By the standards of the day, it was a very generous system. The Department of Public Welfare clients could count on support for housing, food, heating, clothing, and medical care on the order of about $30 to $40 per month per family on average, which was nearly twice what most other cities with welfare programs paid. Like I said, most cities didn't have welfare programs, and those that did tended to be clustered in the industrial Midwest and Northeast. When people had no place to live, or when poor health and disability prevented older adults from caring for themselves, their only recourse for avoiding homelessness and starvation was the county poorhouse, which in the Detroit area was the Wayne County Hospital Infirmary at Eloise, known to us locals simply as Eloise. The Michigan Poor Laws assigned the ultimate responsibility for indigent care to the counties, and Wayne County actually fulfilled that responsibility with some measure of enthusiasm. The Eloise Infirmary prided itself as being the finest poorhouse in the world, as it was called by a contemporary commentator. When the Department of Public Welfare was unable to help a destitute older adult in the community, it was sent to Eloise, and I will discuss Eloise in greater detail shortly. Now, keep in mind that what I've been talking about here is the boom times. So what happened when things went bust, as they did in October of 1929? The stock market crash that began the Depression sent Detroit's economy into a real tailspin. Thousands and then tens and hundreds of thousands of factory workers were thrown out of work within just a few months. By October of 1930, just a year later, more than half of Detroit's manufacturing sector workers were out of a job. Automobile production nosedived, falling more than 75% in the first 2 years of the Depression. Even those who were lucky enough to keep their jobs saw their incomes fall sharply. Auto workers, who were the best paid of the manufacturing employees, experienced a more than 40% cut in wages, even if they managed to avoid unemployment. This level of and underemployment was staggering and quickly led to an unbearable burden on the Detroit Department of Public Welfare. The new poor, as the long-term structurally unemployed were called, began to crowd out the old poor, which were the temporarily idle workers and the widows, orphans, disabled, and elderly who formerly made up the bulk of the welfare caseload. Now, it's difficult to exaggerate the upheaval that the Depression caused in Detroit's municipal welfare system. Within the first 6 months, caseloads skyrocketed, growing 6.5 times, and the spending for those caseloads followed. The Department of Public Welfare expanded as quickly as it could to keep up with growing need, opening several new district offices and doubling its staff between October of 1929 and April of 1930. Doubled its staff in that very short period. However, supply could not keep up with demand, and caseloads increased from an already high average of 76 families per social worker to a crushing load of 209 per social worker. A visitor who came to evaluate the department in June of 1930 noted its chaotic condition and the poor morale of its employees. His report read, in part, that the department gave and kept right on giving. It was itself in a pathological condition. It reflected and reenacted the hysteria of its clients. One telling indicator of this upheaval was when its longtime superintendent, who was described in some of the writings at the time as a sensitive and compassionate man, he had worked in public welfare for nearly 40 years and had run the department since it was established in 1918, suffered what was described as a complete nervous collapse, and he was unable to return to work for months. By the end of 1930, the Detroit Department of Public Welfare was serving over 13 times as many families as it did just before the Depression hit. And remember, that was a heavy caseload to begin with. At the same time, the city faced a sharp decline in property tax revenue of about 40%, which put it on a direct path to bankruptcy. The Public Welfare Commission attempted to deal with this budgetary nightmare by cutting allowances and caseloads to the bone over and over again over the next 2 years, which spurred many protests, such as the one shown in the photograph, and that is actually people protesting their welfare being cut. To deal with the growing problem of homelessness, idled Studebaker and Fisher Body auto plants were lent to the city by the auto companies and converted into giant homeless shelters housing thousands of people. By mid-1932, the Department of Public Welfare had ceased to operate in any real coherent way, and those still remaining on its rolls, including the elderly poor, were reduced to a subsistence ration of bread and milk. Concern in City Hall shifted